Good afternoon to those of you on DC time and here in person, and good morning, good evening to some of you, wherever you may be tuning in from. I'm very glad to have you joining us this afternoon. My name is Dr. Elise Anderson, and I am speaking to you today as a non-resident fellow here at the New Lines Institute, where I coordinate the Uyghur Scholars Working Group. I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. David Tobin, who is here to have an important discussion about a report he published in April of this year, which focused on the Xinjiang Papers, a cache of Chinese government papers. Dr. David Tobin is a lecturer in East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield in the UK. His research on identity and security in global politics focuses on China's ethnic policy and Han-Uyghur relations, and has been published in a number of academic journals. His book with Cambridge University Press, Securing China's Northwest Frontier, Identity and Insecurity in Xinjiang, analyzes the relationship between identity and security in Chinese policymaking and its impact on Han-Uyghur relations. He presented evidence at all three hearings of the Uyghur Tribunal on state violence, as well as the classified document leak that we're here to talk about today, the Xinjiang Papers. David's current research on China's new ethnic policy and genocide includes a new interdisciplinary project documenting Uyghur diaspora voices, which uses film, image, and text to share life stories of Uyghurs separated from their families and homes. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so by way of introduction, I promise I'm going to start asking questions and turn things over to our esteemed colleague here shortly. But I just want to make a quick introduction of the issue for the sake of the audience, if that's all right. So we're here today to talk, very broadly speaking, about ongoing atrocities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the Uyghur region, where representatives of the Chinese party state have, since 2017 and even earlier, been enacting a campaign that includes mass detention, incarceration, torture and violence, sort of totalitarian surveillance, family separation, cultural destruction, religious repression, and more. And we're here today to hear about the role of the central leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and of the Chinese government in designing and commanding the policies that undergird this campaign, which I think we should emphasize a number of governments and government bodies have recognized as atrocity crimes. So we're going to spend the first, I would say, 40 minutes or so in a discussion between Dr. David Tobin and myself, and then we'll open things up for Q&A. So those of you who are joining us by Zoom today, please feel free to submit questions in the course of this discussion, and we are really eager to discuss those with you a bit later. All right, so could you tell us, what are the Xinjiang Papers? So maybe what is their provenance, when were they written or compiled, and then we'll go from there. Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
So the Xinjiang Papers are a collection of official documents. Most of them are classified. They date from 2014 to 2018. These are on varied topics: ethnic policy, history, religious management, population transfers. So there's a range of topics, a range of types of commands, some very abstract, theoretical, some very concrete. They're mostly Xi Jinping speeches, the most significant ones I found from 2014, but also Central Committee commands, sort of repeating his orders. These were leaked to the Uyghur Tribunal, based in London. And the documents are similar to those that appeared in the New York Times, the Show No Mercy leak. They seem to include the same documents, but of course this was anonymously leaked, so we do not know where they came from. And one reason it's impossible to locate is because cadres in China tend to have booklets where they study these types of documents in a collection. So it's difficult to trace where these could have come from because they're sent from Central Committee all the way down to county level government. So many people will have been looking at these for a long time. So we really don't know where they came from, but somebody chose to hand this collection of documents to the tribunal specifically.
Interesting. And so was it an exact match between you mentioned some papers from the New York Times. Maybe some folks in the audience don't know or don't remember a lot of details about those papers. Could you just comment on that briefly and then talk a little more about the relationship between those and the Xinjiang Papers?
Sure. We don't know if they are the same leak from the same person. We can't determine that. We just know that they contain some of the same documents, some of the same, particularly the 2014 speeches. The New York Times reported the speech where Xi Jinping said we should show absolutely no mercy when rounding people up, when implementing ethnic policy at the local level. So that we know these are the same documents. But like I say, because so many cadres are studying these types of documents in different folders, we can't tell if it's the exact same leak, but we know these are the same speeches. And I believe the New York Times did actually comment on that. When we authenticated them, obviously myself, Professor James Millward and Adrian Zenz did the authentication process ourselves. We did look at the New York Times, the reporting and so forth, but we did have to sort of look way beyond that to figure out where they might have come from, but more importantly, what's in the documents themselves.
Okay, so when you say way beyond that, could you kind of unpack what that means or get more specific?
Yeah, that was just the beginning of the process when we had to sit down to authenticate them, really sitting down to assess, are these real and what are these? So, I mean, we all use different methods. The three of us do different types of work. So that was what was so strong about our working together, because we do this very differently. One thing I did was just sit and read them. That was the first thing I did. Just, do these make sense? Are these familiar? Does this tally with what we know about Chinese politics? Does this tally with what I know from reading these types of documents in my research, the types of manuals that cadres study and so forth? So that's the first thing you do. Does it make sense? Is it consistent? And the answer was yes. Because that doesn't prove they're real, it just gives you an idea. So some of the main things we did were, I mean, certainly I looked for the language. Can we find the terms in these documents elsewhere? And we could. The roundup, all those who should be roundup order that was given by Qin Guo, but really, had already been essentially given by Xi Jinping in slightly different language. We found this in different documents. We also found references to the specific speeches in documents, in party meetings. The notion of a period of interventionary treatment that sort of precipitated the mass detention campaign, that had already been mentioned in things like the 2018 Regional Government Report. But we also found lots of references to the documents themselves across state media, including exact quotes from the documents, but not the whole documents themselves. That's standard practice in Chinese politics. I spent months trying to find documents on the original Xinjiang Working Group meetings in 2010, reported widely across state media, but you can't find the documents themselves. We find them years later. So that's standard. But also, I mean, one thing that Adrian Zenz does, and I did in this report, was finding when the documents refer to specific events or visits by leaders, we look, we track that down to see if there's other references, can we verify that those visits happened, and it, this all hung together, and they were clearly authenticated by different scholars. In the report as well that I produced, of course, I used the Conoscere list that had been verified by AFP and Laurie Chen, and of course Jean Bonin, who had helped put it together. And then when I found new local documents, I pursued the same process. I did this myself, and then I handed it to colleagues who also did it. So in the report, Dr. Hannah Thieker also has a statement on how she verified these in quite a lot of detail.
Okay, so it was a very intertextual process in many senses then.
Yes, certainly intertextuality is the first way I would do it. Does this make sense with what we know, with the way language is used? And I think that was something I contributed to the tribunal. One thing that I do when I read these documents, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not trained in international law, so the first thing I'm thinking is, what does a cadre think when he sits down to read this, or when she sits down to read this? What do these terms mean to them, not to me, but to them. So that's an important part of our work, looking in the actual context that they're read in, party meetings, and what those types of terms mean. And of course, the language is very familiar, the policies that we know, things like the three evils concept obviously repeats over and over, ethnic unity over and over, strengthening religious management, all these terms that are in lots of documents that are somewhat vague if you don't know the language or you don't know the area, but once you've been studying them over and over for years, they wash over you because they're repeated so often.
Right, and what I'm thinking listening to you talk about this is that in a way, there was a lot of the evidence that made the Xinjiang Papers leak so remarkable was just already out there, essentially.
What was slightly disappointing for an analyst was that there wasn't more new materials. When I sat down, I thought, oh, this will be the secrets behind closed doors. We'll have lots of new information. There was some, but mostly it was familiar and a bit dull to read, to be honest.
Next.
Yeah.
Where's the new stuff? Okay, interesting. I've never thought about, I don't know, that process in quite this perspective, so.
There is new information. The issues like the document on population optimization in the Bing Tuan stating we want X million Han, I think it was 3 million Han in the region by 2025. That was very, very specific. Mm-hmm. Some of the religious management details were very specific about, for example, not building religious venues that are for one ethnic group. That was slightly different, it was very, very detailed. But in the main, most of this is deeply ideological, intertextual. It doesn't reveal, one document doesn't reveal everything. You need to be reading lots of documents. The TFAT, the key party slogans that a cadre studies the meaning, and then these terms repeat elsewhere, even though it doesn't explain the meaning.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to move on to another question, now that we have a little bit of an introduction to these papers and how you went about analyzing them and studying them. One of the when this was first in the news cycle, right? It's kind of old that we're talking about it now in some senses, although still quite relevant. And I think one of the big things that came up in the news cycle and discussions about this as the leak happened was that these papers seem to provide evidence that the central leadership of the party state was involved in the design, the birth, I don't know exactly how to put it, right, of many of these policies. So what links, what clues did you see to suggest that? And could you talk about that with us?
Yeah. When we were working towards the Uyghur Tribunal deadline, obviously it was very limited for time. So we really focused on verifying and authenticating the documents, just checking they were real, that they had been repeated somewhere. When I started to do work for the report, I found a lot more references to these documents that became not just about authentication, but about analysis of how the system works.
Okay, and one quick point for clarification. With the tribunal, like what time period were you working on it then, and then what was the gap between that and your report coming out?
We really had, I think it was about 6 weeks. To
for
verify them. Yeah. So we focused on authentication, and then I translated and focused on the detail of document 10 that was focused on what was called Islam work and religious management. Okay. So when I turned to the report, I then reread them all and focused on trying to find information and across the internet. Sites that you have to obviously archive because they disappear while you're looking at them, but official sites. And one thing that was important to me and in the types of argument I want to make in the report were not just showing that these are repeated elsewhere, but how they're repeated. What I really found was these documents are being studied quite intensively in cadre meetings, all the way down to county level, local meetings, not just the top leadership stuff. Also, prison staff training. Prison staff are studying Xi Jinping's thought.
Prison staff?
Yeah. They're studying the new security spirit of Xi Jinping, obviously focused on the security dimensions, but the security dimensions and the dimensions that relate to framing Uyghurs as a threat, their identity as a threat are interlinked. But also even in university education, particularly document 5, which is focused on historical issues, which would not ordinarily be thought of as a security matter, but in Xi Jinping's party state, history, identity are security matters. So Agricultural University in Urumqi, we have evidence and photos of students studying the document in great detail. And this obviously includes notions about ethnic extinction, Minzu Xiaowang, that ethnic groups, minority ethnic groups will gradually disappear, and China will be a unified civilization again. So that's the kind of stuff that's been studied in universities, and it is the specific document, not just those issues generally, but the people are studying and chanting the actual document itself. And that's the way that works, may be unfamiliar to people who don't study Chinese politics, but it's very standard for the party to give grand pronouncements, big ideological notions, and then this filters down. I think Adrian Zen's referred to it as an experimental phase, and that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I wouldn't say it's entirely experimental. It's an order. When the order to round up all those who should be rounded up is given, it's in some senses specific. But also there is a little bit of flexibility to it because, who should be rounded up and so forth. But that's absolutely standard practice in Chinese politics. The top leaders give grander pronouncements, big ideas, and then ask the regional government to do the work. And then they report back. So when you read a regional government report, most of it is devoted to saying, this is how we implemented party policy. This is how we implemented this big grand idea. And then if this is monitored, the centre reports back and either reins them in if they're not doing enough, like they did with Wang Yongzhi, who was punished. The Shachi party chair was punished for not rounding up enough people, essentially. It's got violations of discipline. That document is studied widely in prisons as well, and in cadre meetings, and it's called Lessons and Warnings for those who don't implement party policy. And of course, he's disappeared. So it's a way of controlling the local levels. It really puts people in a position where they know if they do not implement policy correctly, they might be in that position too. So it's really, when you couple that with sort of rewards and punishments that are offered to citizens, it puts people in a position where they're almost forced to inform, they're forced to implement policy, or they will be punished themselves.
Interesting. Okay, so it's a top-down system, very much, where still people in sort of lower levels of that political and governing hierarchy are then left to implement how they will. Am I correct?
Yeah, but there's a good example of how it works in terms of the to and fro between centre and province, or party and state, is that document 10 on religious work, on Islam work, because that's one of the documents that's very concrete, and it's really saying that policy hasn't been implemented enough. They're not doing enough, and then there's more specifics about how they should do that. So that's an example of how they're then reined in. For example, saying no new religious venues for single ethnic groups, framing the concentration of Uyghurs in a specific area as a security problem, saying cadres can't visit certain areas if there are too many Uyghurs or too afraid. So it really was saying you must be bolder. You must be willing, you must dare to essentially to monitor, and that's linked to the notion of population optimization, that there are too many Uyghurs in the region. Xi Jinping says some regions even have 90% of Uyghurs, as if this is a problem.
And that's something that Xi Jinping said in one of his speeches.
In the 2014 speeches.
2014 speeches. Okay. And so, to go back to one of your earlier comments introducing the papers, you said that most of these documents are Xi Jinping speeches, or?
No, the ones that I found most useful that I've ended up using mostly were the 2014 speeches, but you see the similar, they're most, this is also because I study ethnic policy, I'm interested in those narratives, the underpinning ideas behind the practices. So that was my focus. Some people focused on Qin Chuanguo's orders because these were more specific and concrete. And then the population optimization documents, that becomes more detailed. The history document comes from the Central Committee. It's not signed Xi Jinping himself. But of course, he oversees the Central Committee, so we know he's approved it. But yeah, I think the 2014 speeches really explain the underpinning ideas behind ethnic policy in the region, that Uyghurs are a security problem, that Islam is a security problem, and that Turkic identity is not real. Therefore, we can remove language from the education system.
Which is really stark to hear and see. I think we could have probably an hours-long discussion on that, maybe in another venue, right? So one question that's coming to mind for me is, and kind of we framed this talk in the same way you titled your report, which is about how Xi Jinping commands policy in the PRC. And I would be curious to know, do you feel that the way he has commanded this policy in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region is the same as the way he commands policy elsewhere in the PRC?
We know it's much tighter in the region. We know that.
How do we know that?
We know that from living there and seeing how people are treated, how the security services work, things that aren't recorded in documents, the way people are, even 2008, where I lived in Urumqi, my Han Chinese friends could visit my apartment block with no questions asked. My minority friends had to sign in at the desk. And getting on a bus or going into public infrastructure, Uyghurs would have to open their bags whilst Han were walking past border patrols. If you go past Kashgar, you see the long line of Uyghurs having to go through their IDs while foreigners in Han just walk past. So we know things we've known for a long time things are tighter in the region in those types of ways. I think one way I would look at it is the narrative of what China is, the narrative of how policy works, and then this implementation is not entirely different elsewhere. The overall program is the same, but the perception of threat is different. So when something is seen as a security issue, then it becomes more monitored. That's why you have these documents flying back and forth saying you must implement more, you must be tighter in your enforcement of policy, because the region is seen as related to the whole nation's stability, and Uyghurs are seen as a security threat itself. The autonomy system has always been a bit of a misnomer. Structurally, it reports to the State Council, so it's arguably less autonomous than the provinces, because it's seen in those security terms. So the types of economic autonomy, if you like to call it that you see in the provinces since the 1990s aren't really afforded to the region that has been its economy still dominated by the state. And really, but what's really different, of course, like when I talk to my China studies friends who will make the argument, but people are oppressed everywhere. Of course they are. But Han Chinese will fulfill with authorities. They're all monitored, they're all surveilled at the street level. But they're not seen as a racialized threat. The Han Chinese will be in trouble in authoritarian terms if they organize politically, if they're dissidents, if they commit actions, whereas Uyghurs are under suspicion already simply by view of their identity, not their actions. So it's a real what's different is the racialization of security, the grid management and so forth that we have all over China, but it's not looking for people of specific ethnicity in Beijing, whereas in the region known as Xinjiang, it's of course targeting and monitoring Uyghurs. Similarly with arguments about sort of exploitation or forced labor practices, what's certainly different in the region is the scale of forced labor, but also that forced labor is designed in party states towards ethnic eradication, towards transformation of people's identities. So it's that issue of racialization that means that everyone is under suspicion.
Thank you for explaining that. How does it link back? I'm asking mostly for the benefit of audience members who might be wondering this themselves. What's the link still back to Xi Jinping then? in a, a system that predates him and with some practices that predate him.
I mean, putting on my analyst hat, yeah, this is a long history of dehumanization in the region that I would focus on in my work. When a people are framed as inhuman or a security problem, this could always happen. It doesn't mean it will, but it means it can. So in my work, for example, my book, I don't argue that this is suddenly caused or came out of nowhere. It's a very long history. But what Xi Jinping has done is give these orders. It's saying we have a new ethnic policy. We must resolve the ethnic problem forever. So one of his big narratives has been that the party focused on development too much. Now we need to focus on security. He calls it the primary contradiction, that focusing on development meant security declined. And unless we resolve security problems, we'll have no development in the region. But of course, security in that context is related to identity, framing Uyghurs as a security problem itself. So he's given those orders, but the notion that Uyghurs are a security problem or that there is an ethnic problem that China must resolve and sort of use development to assimilate minorities gradually, that's not new. That's been there at least since 1949, arguably a lot longer. But what Xi Jinping has done is tried to resolve those contradictions. So that's why you see scholars like Ma Rong, who argued for some policies we see now. He wanted to reframe the ethnic problem as a civilizational problem and absorb barbarians, as he calls them, i.e. non-Han groups. That's why we see him now write. He wrote an essay in 2018 thanking Xi Jinping for resolving the nation's contradictions.
Okay. And most of, again, maybe I'm seeming dense here, but just for the sake of memory, right? 2014 is the key year in all of this.
There's many key years.
Okay.
Yeah, we could go through a lot. I do think 2014 matters, yeah. I mean, those visits in 2014 were very important. That was a signalling moment when he said, we have new conditions because we've had a growth of violence in the region following 2009, the riots in Urumqi, and then the Tiananmen attack, the car incident, and the Kunming knife attack. And that's why we need to solve the ethnic problem forever. So he's announced at that point, we need a new ethnic policy. So that's why that moment is so important. He's put this into practice. The underlying ideas were already there. 2012, the sort of intergenerational policy debate that argued, a new generation argued that the old guard of anthropologists were too focused on development, and now we need to focus on social engineering. This is at the same time, as soon as Xi Jinping came to power, he said, we'll build a great wall of iron around the region to stop terrorists coming in and out, to stop ideas about the West, even in democracy, coming in and out. So it was already there, but 2014 is such a big turning point in terms of policy. But I do also go back to my own research in the region, 2009, following the riots, where I was reading textbooks for university students saying Uyghurs are not a Turkic group, Uyghurs are not an Islamic group, only terrorists would say that. So really at that point, the party state is already saying that Uyghur identity, i.e. Turkicness, and Islam are security problems. You're a terrorist if you identify as those things. So in Wang Lijian, the former policeman that testified at the tribunal, he said this 2009 was a major turning point. That was when police were being told to target Uyghurs en masse, to see them as enemies of the nation. So it's, I do put the responsibility on Xi Jinping for putting these policies through. But the underlying thinking is definitely not new. Going back to 1949 even, saying we'll have peaceful liberation of the region, liberating a people from themselves. The autonomy, the original regional autonomy government documents, the law from 1984, yeah, it talks about modernizing them as peoples, not just building infrastructure or technical things, but talking about language and religion as related to economic development, framing a people, essentially dehumanizing a people as behind, as less developed than the majority. And that's when Xi comes in to say, we'll resolve this problem once and for all. So for me, that really underpins why detention, mass detention, has become quite arbitrary, where you have, I would say it was a form of eliticide initially, where famous artists, intellectuals, imams were all targeted first, all leaders of a community, the elites. They were removed, so there's no leadership to a community. But after that phase, we've just really seen a mass detention that affects anyone, that everyone's under suspicion. For example, the 75 signs of extremism, which cadres can't remember the whole list. There's no way. They're just encouraged to sort of zealously round people up, because you can't memorize it all. I memorized a few. The first one, it says about if you imply that Xinjiang is separate. It's not even saying that you organize a national liberation movement. It's that you're advocating separateness. It's seen as a sign of extremism, but also keeping boxing gloves in your basement. This is obviously not a terrorist act to box in your basement.
Right. As I've followed the issue and worked on the issue over the years, it just became increasingly obvious that anything a Uyghur did could be construed as a sign of terrorism, just for the fact of that person being Uyghur, and thus a security threat in this system and in the particular policies being sort of promoted and encouraged.
It always seemed that way living there. We saw it, I first lived there in 2007. It already seemed that way, but it wasn't as intensified. People were under suspicion, but there were no mass camps. So people talked about family members disappearing and not knowing why, especially after 2009. This happened, but there was still a sense amongst people that you could stay out of politics. Many of the tragic stories I encountered living there were people saying, I'm not political, I want nothing to do with politics, it's not my thing, and then somehow being dragged into it. Often young people that would say those things before they tried to get a job, before they tried to find a house. Trying to find a house where a landlord will say, I want rent to Uyghurs, or trying to find a job and they can't get a good job, or they get paid less than their Han counterparts.
Right.
Once they entered the system, it changed for them.
Apologies, cut you off. Right, I heard the same kinds of stories from my Uyghur friends over the years, and which really just underscores the systemic racism that so many Uyghurs have long faced. I lived in the region, as you know, from 2012 to 2016, and was watching things deteriorate and was watching policies be experimented with and rolled out and such. And it was very obvious that things were getting increasingly tighter, increasingly worse for Uyghurs, but it was really difficult to understand how, and to understand it from up close. But I want to move to talking a little bit about Sinicisation, which is the topic of one of the sections of your report, and of course features really prominently into these documents and into a lot of the policies that have been rolled out. Can you talk about, for maybe a slightly more general audience, what is Sinicization and how is it working in this whole campaign?
Essentially, Sinicization policy is the notion that China is not Chinese enough. For example, Uyghur religion and language are not Chinese. So we need to have policies that will change that state of affairs and make China more Chinese. Now, we knew this was policy in some senses. We knew, in terms of seeing with our eyes, we saw something like the Kargalik Mosque, for example, 2014, where it has domes and minarets. By 2018, these are removed because these are seen as signs of foreign Islam, signs of Arabization. And we see them replaced with slogans saying, love the party, and so forth. So we were seeing these things, mosque demolitions and so forth. We're seeing these things with our eyes. But Sinicization policy is really the underpinning narrative that explains all that. Explains mosque demolitions, renovation to remove features that are deemed foreign, and linguistic erasure as well. And it really, what's being overlooked in the notion of, obviously, Xi Jinping's ideology is quite mixed. In some ways, people will say he's communist, some people will say he's fascist. And in that idea about Sinicization, it does have undertones of fascism because it's about revival of a mythical racial purity. It really goes back, it's not just going back to the 40s or something, it's going back to like the 8th century. to say that the Turkic people died out. It says they left, I think it's document 10, oh, document 5 says they left the stage of history. So it's not a real identity. And this is, I mean, this is central party state policy to be codifying history, codifying how people think about themselves. And it really says that Uyghurs were fooled and conned by Islamists in the 1970s and 80s, and this led to a religious revival. So it has an anti-foreign element as well as a sort of revival element. It uses terms like Saudization, Arabization, and it refers to those as forms of infiltration. It says China can harmonize Islam. So it's saying back in the 14th century we didn't have those problems because we harmonized Islam, it became Chinese, but since then it's become more foreign. It's a form of infiltration. And the real phrase that sticks out is saying that all cultures, including Uyghur culture, are rooted in Chinese civilization, are rooted in Zhonghua Minzhou, and it uses terms like rooted in blood.
So they're rooted in Chinese civilization, but they're not Chinese enough because they've lost their way.
This sort of highlights why Xi Jinping talks about this primary contradiction, because, I mean, in my book, I use the term ambivalence to describe what you said, not because the security practices or the violence are ambivalent, but because that narrative doesn't make sense. It's saying you are Chinese, you can't go anywhere else, you're part of our state, you can't separate, but you're not really included, so we have to continuously convert you. So there's kind of perpetual insecurity that justifies perpetual assimilation. That obviously Uyghurs, certainly Uyghurs in interviews, even 2009, would comment on that explicitly, how ridiculous it is that the contradiction between telling us we're Chinese, that we can't separate, and constantly searching, someone saying, but they search my bag every time I go on the bus and not the hand guy. Or even the notion of the three evils, that any form of thinking about Turkicness or Islam is a threat when everybody knows that Uyghurs generally identify as Muslims, practice Islam, and speak a Turkic language.
Could you let folks who are watching know what the three evils are?
Oh, officially it's separatism, terrorism, and extremism. So obviously those words sound really bad, in principle, but when you look into what they mean, in this context, it's obviously referring to people who use Turkic languages or say we should use Turkic languages more. One Uyghur interview even asked me, what do you call because in Chinese it's the three forces, Sango, Shali. So one asked me, what do you call that? How do you translate it in English? I said, well, the official translation is the three evils. And they were really upset because they thought, because the things they're identifying are not problems, and you've translated this as evil. I say, well, I didn't translate it that way, but that's the official translation. In Chinese, it's forces. So that's making it sound more specific, like it is a terrorist organization. So it is used, it's used interchangeably with East Turkestan, Dongtu, the phrase that they use just to say terrorism. So even in Chinese language, if you want to say the phrase East Turkestan, you are describing a terrorist movement in that language because they use Dongtu to describe East Turkestan or the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the supposed terrorist organization. These are interchangeable. And people adopted that language. I mean, when I arrived in Urumqi, the shopkeeper said, you better run home. Dongtu are coming, Dongtu are coming, because some Uyghurs were walking down the street.
Which then creates some real problems for many Uyghurs around the world who do prefer using East Turkestan as a place name, right, for this region that they're from.
Yes, it's meant that people are very uncomfortable and cautious about whether they should call it that because it's seen as political, because it's seen as associated with terrorism. All names are political, all titles for nations are political, that's fine, there's nothing we can do about that. But it does mean that Uyghurs debate, what should we call ourselves? Should it be East Turkestan? Should it be Xinjiang? Should it be the Uyghur region? All of which are different types of political names. Xinjiang obviously being a colonial name, the very meaning of it, new frontier, when it's about a people's homeland, it's not a frontier to them. That's obviously a colonial name, a very political name. So is East Turkestan. I mean, East Turkestan would be a political name if you're saying you want a separate state. Of course, that's politics, but that's life. I mean, for me, it's not, and I do want to say it's not my job to decide what Uyghurs call themselves, if they want to call them their homeland, the Uyghur region, or Weten, or East Turkestan, or even Xinjiang. That's not my call. My job is to listen, to analyse. I think they have the right to call their homeland whatever they wish.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the three evils, as we often do translate it in English, is that in some senses, I guess I could say the party state as the actor has done a somewhat good job of convincing a lot of people that something like a desire for self-determination is evil in and of itself, right?
Yes, I mean, that's something that, I mean, somebody like Sean Roberts obviously wrote a little bit about the conflation between separatism and terrorism, that these are not necessarily the same things. Obviously, I was born in Scotland, where we do have, we had a referendum for self-determination. Arguably, that is a form of separatism, but it's definitely not terrorism. Terrorism usually means killing civilians for political performance, which is just not the same as saying I wish that cultures fit into this nation state.
Right.
Completely
so there's
different terms.
all sorts of, there's just like conceptual conflation happening all over the place. It sounds like just in the political discourse in general, but then also in the Xinjiang Papers in particular even.
Yes, that's why it is so important to look at how cadres would read those documents, what those terms actually mean to them, because when you say terrorism, of course, terrorism is a bad thing, but we have to look what does it actually mean in this context, and it's conflating all sorts of practices, beliefs. And we saw in the Connacht-Shahar list, the number of people put in prison for terrorism charges are very, very small. And also things like advocating the average sentence for advocating was larger than being in a terrorist organization. There's violent terrorist activities and terrorist activities. The violent terrorist activities got larger sentences, but I'm not quite clear how you can, succinctly define non-violent terrorist activities as opposed to violent ones. So it's lots of conflation, which really, I think that's deliberate. It feeds into the arbitrariness that Uyghurs people are a threat, their culture is a threat, and that is why cadres become incentivized to be more zealous.
And why the party state feels that it must cynicize Uyghurs and their religion and their life ways and on and on.
Yes, it really does. It's framing people's ordinary identity as a form of terrorism. That's been and it's presented as benevolent, or that we understand you've been hoodwinked, you've been conned, that type of language. You've been conned by Islamists from outside. It's not your real identity. So the fake identities. Colonial manipulation is another term that was used a lot in 2009 to say that British imperialists, they invented the term East Turkestan and sort of inspired Uyghurs to try and separate, when of course we know that the term Turk was used for centuries, and East Turkestan seemed to be fairly established as a term in the 19th century, according to anthropologists like Ildiko Bellerhan that have done serious research on the topic.
Wow. There's so much more I want to ask. I have questions I came prepared with, other questions that have come to mind. But since we're nearing the end of the hour, I think we have maybe about 15 or so minutes left. It might be great to open up questions to the audience if we've gotten any. So, okay, it looks like we might have some.
Yes, thank you so much for being here today and the enlightening talk. We have just a couple questions from the chat. The first one is a very informative discussion. Thank you. What policy recommendations would you make for the U.S. to influence or change China's approach in Xinjiang regarding treatment of the Uyghurs? Are punitive tools such as sanctions and economic restrictions the only viable option? Or are there certain constructive measures the U.S. can take in parallel to influence Chinese policy?
Thank you for the extremely complex, sensitive question.
I can repeat any piece of that if you
It's
need.
an important one. It is an important one. I hate to be negative, but I don't think diplomacy can change these policies. There's no evidence to suggest that quiet diplomacy would work in this context. Diplomacy is essential, but not for those reasons. That's to keep channels open in the hope that we'll have better relations in the future. But we need a strategic rethink to avoid that trap, because this isn't negotiable. Xi Jinping is quite clear this is a core security interest and it's non-negotiable. All states have those non-negotiable areas. That's normal. But obviously Xi Jinping is implying that anything to do with the region is a security matter. So I really think, I mean, the key areas that the US and other democratic societies are going to be looking at are forced labor. And this means investments back and forth, supply chains. We know that the tomatoes that go into tomato sauce and all the cotton coming out of the region are generally tainted with forced labor. We do need to block that. I mean, there should be trade sanctions on companies that are using forced labor. This seems a no-brainer. Modern slavery is wrong. And then another thing that is slightly different, I mean, whether this influences the party or not is another matter, but something that will be very important are issues that affect diaspora lives. There are now thousands of Uyghur diaspora living in the US that face many, many problems to do with residential status, residence permits, can they travel, and so forth. One solution to that is, of course, the fast-track system. I think it's called the P2 status. That would be very helpful for at least, this does not bypass security checks, but it acknowledges that Uyghurs are not being targeted because they're political dissidents, but because of their ethnic origins. And the other thing is, of course, monitoring the transnational repression that they experience. That is an issue of human rights, because they have a right to be here and to be free, but also a security matter, because they are being monitored by agents of the party state at times, and this makes many of them frightened to speak out. People say, why are there only specific Uyghurs' voices being amplified? And the answer is usually because most people are too scared or unable to speak out because they know their family back home will be harmed. So we need more statements and more concrete actions to support those people and to make sure their families stay safe and that they're supported if their families are harmed.
Right, and if I might jump in, just to give my own 2 cents on that, I think you covered most of the things I would have covered myself, but we do have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is now being implemented, and I think many of us are watching this very closely and very eagerly to see to what extent CBP, for instance, is actually implementing, to what extent it's changing corporate and other behavior. I think we, for the organizations we work in, or as individual citizens, people can do a lot to continue to put pressure on institutions and so forth to work on that implementation. I think also the refugee issue, certainly for Uyghurs in America, but for Uyghurs in the diaspora all over the world, is deeply important, and one that is so intricately linked to the transnational repression that you were just talking about. I do think that the United States, allied countries, like-minded countries, can do a whole lot more to protect Uyghurs, especially those countries who have done the most by way of legislation or recognition of atrocity crimes and so forth. These countries, these governments have a responsibility to then protect Uyghurs and ensure that they can live lives of dignity and respect.
Yeah, and to add to that, really, I mean, most Uyghurs I've met in North America just want to build a life. They just want to be able to be left alone most of the time. So they're not really asking for much, and they just want to be able to build lives.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question. What role is played in Xinjiang by the Ministry of State Security, the PLA Intelligence Bureau, and the UFWD?
1 minute, go.
Yeah. I mean, the way I look at these is these are subservient to the central party state's orders. So that when I analyse this, what really matters is the orders from the top. So they're implementing orders. The same way that people focus on Xinjiang Uyghur, especially for sanctions, there's a tactical reason to do that. He has given orders, but at the end of the day, these people are appointed by Xi Jinping for political purposes. So that's the most important thing. The United Front Work Department is, as far as I know, the significance is more internationally. Certainly the UK government has released statements about its interference in UK politics. Obviously that revolves around transnational repression, information warfare and so forth. Within Xinjiang, obviously the PSB, the Security Bureau are important. We saw that in the Xinjiang police files. All the speeches that were in there, particularly by Zhao Kezhi, the head of the PSB. I mean, he's clearly giving these orders, the shoot-to-kill orders, repeating shoot-to-kill orders, saying that policy is working correctly, repeating the roundup orders, holding training sessions. So he's really putting this into practice. But really, I do think the orders come from the top, and these people are appointed for a reason. They're appointed because they will put things into place that Xi Jinping will be happy with.
What about the other parts of that question were things like the Ministry of State Security, the People's Liberation Army?
The People's Liberation Army is, one thing that's particularly significant, I would say, is prior to 2009, its key base was not in the region, it was in Gansu. Of course, following the 2009 violence, it was moved into the region. This was seen before 2009. It was often written about as a form of insecurity. They didn't want to base themselves there because it's too dangerous if things did become, if there was a separatist movement. But of course now the PLA base is north of Urumqi. So the biggest takeaway there is that there's now a much larger presence of PLA in the region that are under command from the centre. So, for example, when the 2009 riots broke out, there were not as many PLA there, so it was PAP, the People's Armed Police, and even Bing Tuan militias that were first responders, as it were. Now the PLA are there to be first response in any incidents.
Thank you. Our next question, and this one might be the last one that we have time for. Is terrorism an actual problem in Xinjiang, or is it created by the Chinese state as an excuse for controlling Turkic Muslims?
I don't believe terrorism is a problem in the region, no. If we look at the Kona Shahar list, 10,000 people taken from their homes in a small village. If there were 10,000 terrorists in a small village, the level of violence we would see in the region would be enormous. That's not to say there's no violent people, there's no bad guys, of course there are, like everywhere. But that doesn't mean there's organised terrorist elements. That's something very, very different. So yes, it's used as a tool to control, but if you reframe it and think, what does the party state mean by terrorism, identity, then I suppose it is a problem. Uyghurs are Muslims and they do speak a Turkic language, and that is being framed as the problem. So short answer is no, it's not a real problem. It's a narrative framing to describe how assimilation will proceed.
Well, in the last few minutes we have, I would like to ask one more question myself, which is something that might be on some viewers' minds. Just a little over a week ago, Xi Jinping went on an inspection tour of the XUAR, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this was his first in-person visit to the region since 2014, this somewhat seminal year we've spoken of. So what do you make of this? What do you think it signals? What do you think his visit signals to us about the future of policy there and how he intends to command it?
It's obviously a signal that the region is still vitally important to national security. It's of the utmost importance, hence why he visits the region at all. So it's stressing the importance of the region. However, the suddenness of the visit, that it was not really announced, does sort of reveal a little bit of insecurity about the region. I don't think that insecurity is domestic. I think that's about the international context. That is what Ma Xingrui, the new party chief, said, that the new focus of policy is international, essentially implying that the region is now pacified, the region is now secure, but the threats come from abroad, Islamic terrorists, in his terms, and foreign researchers like us that do research on things that happen in the world. She really repeated the same types of narratives we see in the history document that I mentioned about Uyghur cultures rooted in China's civilization. He didn't, he says Genmai at the root. He doesn't use the same racialization in that speech. He doesn't use the blood and soil kind of language. But that's fairly standard in Chinese politics. The notion that there is racism in China is often downplayed, and it's all about culture and civilization. But we know that's not really true, because these phrases like the ancestors of the dragon and so forth are racialized. This is a racialized term, and this is widespread even in Chinese international relations theory. The way when people are talking about world order, people like Liu Mingfu, who was sort of dismissed because he was a general and he was seen as a hawk, because you've seen it's a race, a marathon and a race between civilizations and races. William Callahan's written about this. He was dismissed as a sort of hawk, and it didn't matter very much, but we've just seen recently some Wang Jise, international relations theorist, that's seen as a very sort of calm voice. He's just a standard realist. He was recently giving a talk about how China is a representative of the yellow race. So I do think that type of narrative is important to understand why Xi Jinping will continue to pursue his policy, because he's staked his legitimacy on this policy, but also the way he will bat away any criticism from outside as in racialized terms, describing the Uyghur Tribunal as an Anglo-Saxon conspiracy, which is obviously, it was dismissed in the tribunal as just silly talk. It's not really how realism ordinarily works, that states have sovereignty and pursue self-interest. This is a slightly different ideology, that you have large-scale civilizations and races. That is there, and that is sort of underpinning his overall thinking, but it's also a signal that policy is going to continue as planned.
And so life is going to continue to be much as it has been, I suppose, for Uyghurs, for Kazakhs, for other Turkic majority Muslim peoples in the region.
Some things are changing, but the overall picture is not. Obviously, appointing Ma Xingrui, who's in the aerospace clique, he seems a technocrat. That signals we're turning towards business. We're going to be more open. But they've also said the policy is completely correct. They've kept all the institutions in place. All the surveillance mechanisms I read about in the report are all there. So these haven't gone away. But this is now an attempt to boost business, to say we're going to be more open to investment, and we want to be more open to the world if you play ball.
Which just highlights the importance of work like yours and the need for policymakers here in the United States, in the UK, and around the world to continue addressing this issue.
It is important, and I do hope that policymakers will think about the big picture, think about they don't have time to spend their lives thinking about the history, but realizing how serious this is, that this is not just an irrational outburst since 2017. Xi Jinping is fairly fervent in his beliefs about civilization, about the Chinese race, that are hard to just bat away. He's not wanting to back down, but it also makes it very important to show that this is not about the West being superior to China. This is about people being put in camps for no reason. And that could set a precedent for the world, that camps and arbitrary detention become norms. That affects us all. And it's important to show this is not a Western conspiracy. other states should speak about this. It does not matter where you're from to object to this.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research and your insights with us today. This was a real delight for me to be in discussion with you. And thanks to all of you who joined us in the audience. I highly recommend that you check out, read if you are interested, Dr. David Tobin's paper on the Xinjiang Papers. And also a new paper that just came out this week, which he co-authored with Dr. Laura Murphy and Narola Elimet on the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps and its links to forced labor. So again, thank you all for being with us, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.